Hello there, I'm Alex. This is a presentation on social norms, and more specifically, how they're manipulated by advertisers and PR companies in service of the oil industry. This is a good place to start because we can map out the PR actions from public documents and relate them to how they manipulate public opinion and affect the well being of individual people. The PR industry has made an art out of using the way our individual brains make decisions to manipulate us to buy what they're selling. While they have many weapons gleaned from social psych data, their most potent is creating social norms. And they do this by employing some other psychology topics like the mere exposure effect, the informational influence of conformity, 6 principles of persuasion, the benefits of being part of a group, and heuristics. First, let's look at heuristics, because it gives a solid foundation for the interplay between advertisers and our brains. According to cognitive psychology, heuristics are mental shortcuts. And I don't know if I'm the only psychology major who thinks this. I don't seem to see it mentioned anywhere, but mental shortcuts seems like an overly ephemeral and amorphous definition to me for a scientific term. But going with this definition, we get some context for the social problem. According to simple heuristics that make us smart, they're mental shortcuts we create for ourselves that are shared by large percentages of the population. And these mental shortcuts are what is exploited by advertisers and PR companies, as outlined by a plan set in motion by the American Petroleum Institute. Guy Gerenzer and Todd outlined 3 main heuristics: representativeness, our brain's tendency to make judgments based on what is typical; availability, decisions based on what easily comes to mind; and anchoring and adjustment, judgments and decisions that rely on what information is presented first. The American Petroleum Institute's plan, whether intentional or not, runs parallel to this 3-pronged idea. The document was leaked to the New York Times in 1998, and you can look it up in my reference list under Walker. As the New York Times describes, they measured success by tracking the percent of media articles that raise questions about climate change, the number of members of Congress exposed to their materials on climate science, number of communications on climate science received by members of Congress from their constituents, number of radio talk show appearances by scientists questioning the prevailing views of climate change, number of school teachers and children reached with their information on climate science, number of science writers briefed and who report upon climate science uncertainties, and total audience exposed to newspaper, radio, and television coverage of science uncertainties. So just to acknowledge the scope, this PR plan involves tracking every communication received by every member of Congress about climate denial. They're going to track the size of the audience for every TV and radio show and newspaper article that disseminates climate denial science. The New York Times called it a daunting public relations task in 1998, but in retrospect, its implementability seems greater with the help of networks like Fox News. They said then that exposing the plan at that stage would probably ruin the effort to raise money to carry it out. But did it? An analysis by the British newspaper The Guardian in 2015 would indicate that many of the tactics were rolled out in subsequent years. So this would indicate to me, and I think any rational person, that the PR campaign laid out by Joe Walker and exposed by the New York Times was directly aimed at creating social norms around global warming that were favorable to the oil industry. And they did this by manipulating various sources of media. Manipulation of the media was addressed in social psychology by the researchers Katherine Happer and Greg Philo in 2013. They give a large amount of credence to how often an audience is exposed to a topic, the mere exposure effect, and in the case of climate change and other scientific topics, The authority of the person giving the message. By exposing an audience to an expert opinion repeatedly, members of that audience are more likely to change their opinions to line up with those of the expert. If mere exposure effect and appeal to authority are the guns, the 6 principles of persuasion are the ammo. The 6 principles of persuasion can be found in any social psych textbook. According to Daniel Richardson, they are: you have an urge to reciprocate, you feel a need to be consistent, you seek social proof, you have a desire to be liked, you respond to authority figures, and you'll jump at something that implies scarcity. By manipulating these principles, advertisers and PR actors like Joe Walker were able to create norms and opinions that spread between individual people like a common cold. Appeal to authority is an integral part of Walker's plan. Happer and Fila put it this way: the prominence of oil industry representatives has meant that even public service broadcasters have turned to them in their sourcing of experts, rather than genuine scientists and experts such as engineers. As a result, news is shaped by this construction of polarization and conflict. The media, rather than the scientists or even the politicians setting the terms of the debate, meaning that the key scientific arguments upon which policy is based are constantly undermined. Walker's plan organizes scientific education task groups that influence real science organizations and distributes what he calls, quote, educational materials directly to schools. Social psychology has established how seeing something over and over again compels you to like it. Richardson details a classic experiment by the researcher Bob Zajonc, where he had people guess the meaning of 2 Kazakh words from Kazakhstan. The words were Tagat and Solman. One means noxious or repellent, the other means loving or devoted. Can you guess? Since this is a social psychology presentation, you probably know something is up. The words are actually meaningless gibberish. Zajonc created them to prove a point. Tagat contains groups of letters rarely encountered in English, while Solman contains letters that are frequently seen together. Zajonc posits that more people reported positive feelings towards Solman because they see those letters together more often, and he called this the mere exposure effect. Besides familiarity, popular support is another powerful dimension of social norms. The influence popular support can have on whether or not you believe a claim is outlined succinctly in another experiment, a straightforward 2x2 study using an ANOVA by Rodolfo Baxter and Lucas. Their conclusions indicate that people were more inclined to believe in ESP when told that public support for it was high versus when they were told that public support was low. They were able to isolate public support as having a strong influence on whether an individual would make a decision or not. As you can see here in the standard deviation scores, the lower the standard deviation score, the more likely someone is to believe ESP is possible. The field of social psychology may seem subjective and ambiguous at times, but our information is weaponized with precision by the PR industry on massive scales. PR campaigns like Joe Walker's literally shift everyone's opinion in the country, or at least enough people to have the effects they want. Having our opinions manipulated by an industry for their profit is a violation of our well-being and a social problem that social psychologists are uniquely qualified to address. Social psychologists exist to help people. The PR industry exists to generate profits for themselves. Any seeming overlap is a conflict of interest. It may seem possible that manipulating public opinion is good for individuals somehow, but it is a means to an end, and if that end is to generate profits for an industry like oil, it is not focused on the well-being of individuals. These issues are not black and white. Another experiment that adds depth to our understanding of how social norms affect an individual's decision making is one by Van Kaplan, Cornet, Coles, and Saraglou. Their experiment was complex, so I'll abbreviate it. Participants were shown a priming word, either religious or neutral, and then a jumble of letters, and told to indicate whether the letters could spell out a word or not. Then, nearby, there was a suggestion of whether or not people indicated if this group of letters made a word or not. Their study shows that participants exposed to a religious priming word, whether they were religious or not, were more likely than a control group to assimilate information from peers into their response tasks. This example demonstrates how not only does the information we're exposed to affect us in certain ways, we can be primed first to make us more susceptible to conformity. So far, we've discussed various aspects of how Joe Walker's plan to combat climate science has played out in various ways. But there is another important dimension to this plan. Even if we know information is fake, our brains and bodies process it as if it were real. Even a knowingly fake situation can affect us emotionally. This was illustrated in an experiment on empathy. Researchers did a copy of the Milgram study, but instead of an actor, they used a computer avatar as the victim. They hypothesized that the perception of someone else's emotional state automatically evokes an internal emotional representation of that state. So while their study had different aims than the Milgram study, they used Milgram's method and replaced the actual victim with a computerized avatar. This had the added effect of being able to pass an ethical review board by not causing too much emotional stress on participants. Sure enough, while participants electrocuted the victim, they were scanned under an fMRI. Participants showed activity in parts of the brain that are activated when someone experiences physical pain. I personally took part in an experiment once where I had to drive a virtual car and avoid obstacles that would pop out into the road. At one point, right after a turn and while some other things were going on to confuse me and make me speed up, a child ran into the road and I hit the child. There were no graphics, it was a pretty low-grade video game, and the thing just disappeared when I hit it. But I was still a little emotionally distraught. I questioned the experimenter afterwards, and she said it was designed that way. She also said it used to be a dog, but people were much more upset by hitting an imaginary dog. So I can personally attest. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, heuristics are mental shortcuts, and now we can expand on that in the context of guns and ammo of the PR industry. Going back to our heuristics model, social norms are almost any form of mental shortcut. The researchers Guy Garenzer and Todd say, social imitation helps us make decisions with limited time and knowledge. Following heuristics such as eat what older and more experienced conspecifics eat, or prefer mates picked by others, can speed up decision making by reducing the need for direct experience. Other research breaks this effect down into measurable parts. Experimental participants were shown 15 questions each. Then, after they answered, were shown someone else's responses and asked if they wanted to revise their answers. This rendered opinion changes as traceable and social influence as measurable. In their experiment, they also corroborate the concepts of the mere exposure effect and the response to authority. They refer to these two major attractors of opinion as the expert effect, which is induced by the presence of a highly confident individual in the group, and the majority effect, which is caused by a critical mass of lay people sharing the same opinions. When a school of fish encounters a predator in the water, they all seem to move at once away from it automatically. No one directs this process. Researchers outline how individuals automatically process information from a group and make others' opinions their own without even thinking consciously about it. They call these self-organizing mechanisms. and comprehending them is among today's most interesting challenges. They compare the self-organizing behavior of pedestrians to that of a school of fish, and say that our opinions, like our actions, are incorporated from others in a similar way. One individual prints their solution to a problem on the environment, and it is automatically shared by others. This confirms the heuristic viewpoint of social norms I described earlier. According to social psychology, complex opinions can form almost instantly in social settings. They refer to it as an informational cascade. An informational cascade is similar to a heuristic, but one that's viewed by someone else. You encounter a situation, you make a decision, perhaps about what style of clothing to wear to an event or job. Then this decision is observed by someone else who just copies it. Each subsequent person doesn't have the same information available as the person they observe, but they can make assumptions and justify the same decision. Yaniv gives a theoretical framework to a similar phenomenon, asking for advice. Seeking advice and observing what other people wear or eat are similar to looking up directions or seeking medical treatment. Advice comes in many forms, and we incorporate it into our lives constantly. The factors Yaniv outlined are closely tied to the social norms of responding to authority. As Yaniv notes, the use of advice improves accuracy of decision-making substantially. If we think about this in relation to the media and oil industry, paid scientists are a potent tool for PR campaigns like the one developed by Joe Walker. You know to look to an expert for something like medical advice, just like you learned what to eat and what not to eat by watching people who had figured it out before you. The destructive social forces driven by PR campaigns are the root of many of society's current problems, like health and environmental problems, and our ability to agree on facts. While these repercussions may not interest PR executives, individuals feel the burn by questioning reality, making decisions against their own best interests, and catching resentments for no good reason. The prestige press engage in a continuous juggling act of portraying all sides that mitigates against any meaningful and urgent coverage of the issue. These manufactured social norms have real negative effects on people's lives, and social psychologists are uniquely qualified to address the matter. Psychologists already work with the legal system in various capacities. New laws can be enacted that address these current problems. The law already accounts for persuasion in various ways, and intent is an important factor in crimes like insider trading. These areas can be brought together to help politicians and scientists wrest the discussion away from the PR industry and other actors with conflicts of interest, and social psychologists can lead the way.